Accept their dead and prepare for their funerals, China's blunt message to MH370 families as they vent fury at Malaysia's poor handling of the search. Chinese state newspaper urges families to not let anger prevail over facts. Says they should accept evidence that plane had crashed in Indian Ocean. Set back in search as orange objects spotted turn out to be fishing gear. Prime Minister Tony Abbott visited Perth RAAF base Pearce this morning. Declared that all evidence points to the plane going down in Indian Ocean. Australia is pushing to retain control of the search operation. Wants wreckage analysed in Australia by Australian, US, British officials. Mr. Abbott defended Malaysian PM's announcement last week that the 239 passengers on board were dead. He said they owed it to families to continue searching for quite some time. Grieving relatives of the Chinese nationals on board flight MH370 have been told to divert their anger away from the Malaysian government and focus instead on making funeral arrangements. In a hard-hitting editorial, a Chinese state-run newspaper urged the families to accept evidence that the Malaysian Airlines plane had crashed in the sea with no survivors. Relatives have strongly criticized Malaysia's handling of the search, including the decision last week to say that, based on satellite evidence, the plane had ditched in the Indian Ocean on March 8. Nearly 30 family members flew to Kuala Lumpur yesterday to vent their anger at the government, unfurling banners saying, "Hand us the murderer. Tell us the truth. Give us our relatives back." China has also been critical of Malaysia's investigation, but in a sign of its softening stance, the official China daily newspaper urged the families not to direct irrational words and behavior towards the officials. It said it was understandable that not all sensitive information could be made public. Although the Malaysian government's handling of the crisis has been quite clumsy, we need to understand that this is perhaps the most bizarre incident in Asia civil aviation history, the editorial read today. Public opinion should not blame the Malaysian authorities for deliberately covering up information in the absence of hard evidence. It said they should now accept the evidence and begin preparing for the funerals of their loved ones. All the related parties can do is to continue to search for the wreckage, carry on negotiations with the Malaysian side for more information and prepare to make arrangements for funerals. But we should not let anger prevail over facts and rationality. It comes as the search for the missing jet was dealt another setback today when Australian officials revealed a cluster of orange objects spotted by a search plane was nothing more than fishing equipment. The crew of an Australian P-3 Orion search plane spotted at least 4 orange objects that were more than 2 meters 6 feet in size on Sunday, and the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Russell Adams, dubbed the sighting their most promising lead in the search for Flight 370. But on Monday, Jesse Platts, a spokesman for the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, said the objects had been analysed and officials had confirmed they have nothing to do with the missing flight. Earlier, Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott confirmed that all hope is lost for the missing Malaysia Airlines flight by declaring all evidence points to the plane going down in the southern Indian Ocean. Speaking to reporters from the RAAF base in Pearce, north of Perth, Mr. Abbott this morning defended the Malaysian Prime Minister's announcement via text message last week that the 239 passengers on board were dead. The accumulation of evidence is that the aircraft has been lost and it has been lost somewhere in the south of the Indian Ocean, Mr. Abbott said. That's the absolute, overwhelming way of evidence, and I think Prime Minister Najib Razak was perfectly entitled to come to that conclusion. I think once that conclusion had been arrived at, it was his duty to make that conclusion public. The announcement was heavily criticized last week for being insensitive and speculative due to the limited evidence, most notably that authorities still have no idea where the plane actually crashed. Last week, the Australian Maritime Safety Authority shifted the search area 1,000 kilometres closer to the country's west coast based on new calculations. Mr. Abbott said this was an extraordinarily difficult operation and he would not be putting a time limit on the search effort. I think we owe it to the families, we owe it to everyone who travels by air, we owe it to the governments of countries who had citizens on that aircraft, we owe it to the wider world who has been transfixed by this mystery for 3 weeks now, he said. We owe it to everyone to do whatever we reasonably can, and we can keep searching for quite some time to come, and we will keep searching for quite some time. If anything, the intensity of the search and magnitude of the operation is increasing, not decreasing. If nothing of substance is found, obviously such a point where we stop searching is eventually reached, but we are well short of that point. If this mystery is solvable, we will solve it. The Prime Minister said his office was in hourly contact with the Rescue Coordination Center and was happy to bear the majority of the costs for the search operation. This is a major international incident, and Australia has the lead responsibility for operations inside our search and rescue zone, he said. At the moment every country is bearing its own costs, and obviously, we here in Australia will bear the costs of running the coordination center. It's a cost we think is only reasonable as the country whose search and rescue zone the aircraft has come down. It's only reasonable we should bear this cost. It's an act of international citizenship on Australia's part. We are happy to be as helpful as we can to all of the countries that have a stake in this. Mr. Abbott said his primary reason for the visit to the RAAF base was to thank all personnel involved for their tireless work in the air over the past 3 weeks. He will travel to Japan, Korea and China in the coming days to thank their respective governments for their contributions in the search. Mr. Abbott's comments come as Australia, Britain and the United States are pushing for a leading role in the investigation amid concerns that Malaysia is not capable of conducting the investigation by itself. Australian officials were in Malaysia over the weekend to urge the Malaysian government to promise that any wreckage recovered during the search would be examined in Australia before being removed to Malaysia. They are also asking Malaysian authorities to agree that if the missing plane's flight data recorders are recovered, their contents should be examined and analysed in Australia by Australian, British and US experts. Such a request may not be received well by Malaysia, which is smarting from criticism about its handling of the disappearance, in particular the seeming insensitivity displayed when it texted the relatives of those on board the plane to let them know that there was no chance they would be found alive. Under civil aviation law, Malaysia, as the country in which the lost plane was registered, is granted responsibility for the investigation. Today's search activities involved a total of 10 aircraft from 7 nations.